My name is Kristen Wands. I am the curator here. I've been here since the fall of 2016. And so I'm still really getting to know this collection. We have a huge amount of things in storage. And the idea behind these behind-the-scenes presentations that I've been doing is to get some of those things out of storage that we don't have space or opportunity to display normally, and get them out so people can see them. So I have 10 quilts here today that I'll be talking about. This is just a very small fraction of the number of quilts that are in our collection total. Most of them are stored on rolling racks in our textile storage, and that rack holds, it's like 6 deep, 9 rows high, so there are a lot of quilts there. And then we also have some additional quilts folded up in boxes. So I went through and selected some that I thought would be good for storytelling. But when the world is different and better, if there are any other types of quilts that you're curious about, we can make an appointment and I can pull them out in storage for anyone who's anxious to study them. So what I was trying to do when I selected these was select a variety of styles and sort of show the full range of the collection. We have a particularly strong collection of log cabin quilts and crazy quilts, which is why you'll see a great many of those, but I also tried to pull out some earlier styles. Any questions before I get started? Okay, I do plan to keep my mask on the whole time because I just think it's safer for everyone here, including for myself. So if you do have trouble understanding me, let me know, and I can repeat what I'm saying. I think the microphone should help, and I've also tried to put enough clues in the PowerPoint presentation so that you can understand what I'm talking about, even if you can't read my lips. But if there is a problem, let me know, and feel free to interrupt me and ask questions. So among the earliest quilts in our collection is this one. It's the first one over there in the first row. And this is a Mariner's Compass quilt. It was made sometime between 1850 and 1860, but it uses fabrics that were printed between 1820 and 1850. This quilt came into the museum's collection in 1926. It was a gift of a woman named Jeanette Morrison. She lived her entire life in her family's home right here in Windsor at 26 Island Road. She was an early and involved member of the Historical Society, and there was a 1922 article in the Hartford Courant that mentioned her gift to the museum of Jabez Haskell Hayden's History of Windsor, the book. And I was surprised that was such a newsworthy event, but she seems to have continued her involvement with the museum after that, since the quilt didn't come to us until 1926. We don't know who made the quilt. There's a chance it was Jeanette herself, but more likely it was probably her mother, who was Harriet Bartholomew, her stepmother Maria, who was born in 1820, or her aunt Clara, born in 1822. But she might have been made by an aunt or something that we don't know about, or maybe she was a collector, an early collector. The antiques collecting was just getting rolling around the turn of the century and became quite popular around then. So we don't know, which is why I urge you, are any of you actually quilters here today? A couple of you? Awesome. Please sign and date your quilts to help out future historians, because that's one of the big challenges here, is trying to figure out who did what, when, and why. So, if you're a quilter, you likely already know this, that the Mariner's Compass design is points radiating from a circle at the center, which is opposed to star shapes that radiate from a square, like the Sati star ones I have illustrated on the right side of the slide. The earliest known English quilt made in the Mariner's Compass pattern is dated to 1726, while the earliest known American example, which survives, is dated to 1834. And during the period, these went by many names, not just Mariner Compass, but also sometimes you'll hear them called Sunburst, Chips and Whetstones, and this is my favorite one, the Explosion, which is very evocative. But we do know that Mariner's Compass quilts were made and that the Mariner's Compass name was used in America as early as 1798. On January 9th of that year, writing to her father, who was at home in Maine, while she was away at a women's boarding school in Medford, Massachusetts. A young lady named Eliza Southgate wrote, "You mention in your letter my pieces which you say you imagine are purloined. I am very sorry if they are, for I set more by them than any of my other pieces. One was the mariner's compass, and the other was a geometrical piece." So we knew she was learning quilting at this boarding school. It seems like she mailed these works home to show off to her parents, and at some point along the way they disappeared, which to my mind is just absolutely heartbreaking. I hope they were found at some point. I don't know, there are no other letters about it, but it was work she was really proud of, so that kind of made me sad. But we get a lot of information from that little snippet. So based on extant examples of other mariners' compass quilts, we know that these were really, really popular along the eastern seaboard, and that likely has something to do with our region's involvement in maritime trades. Merchant ships, whaling, and because of all that, people saw a lot of maps, and the main theory about the design is that it's derived from compass roses you see on maps in the period. This is a very early compass rose from a 1753 Dutch map, and it has that great design that is so similar. This quilt is from the MFA Boston. And so one quilt historian went so far as to say that if you are going to call your quilt a mariner's compass, it should probably have either 16 or 32 points, because this way it would match up with these compass roses you find on maps. Can you count the points on ours? It took me a few tries because counting points in a circle, I always forget which one I started on. Ours has only 24, so I was like, oh no, can I still call it a mariner's compass? And I started looking at other examples. Well, this is another quilt at MFA Boston. It also has only 24 points, and if MFA Boston says it's a mariner's compass, it's a mariner's compass, so we can still call ours a mariner's compass too. So this is just to show the range of fabrics that were used in the quilt. I think, I didn't put it in the slide, but when you get up close, in the top corner, there's this really cool blue and white wavy print, which I think is a very early roller print. You can print textiles with a flat plate or using a roller to make a continuous design, and the roller was like new technology, and I think that wavy design would have to be a roller print design, which is pretty cool, plus the color is so vibrant. And a kind of color that, according to Barbara Brockman, you only really see in these early 19th century quilts. Similar to that paisley print in the top one there. All right, so what do you think? Was this quilt made by one of Jeanette Morrison's ancestors? Did she quilt it? Was she thinking of shipping and the Connecticut River or the shoreline when she made it? We'll never know. Which is why I always write down what you're thinking, make the quilts, to make my job easier. So the next quilt is the one you're sitting at. It is a Hexagon Mosaic quilt. It was made with a technique called English paper piecing. Any of the quilters ever tried any English paper piecing? This is my preferred way to do quilting, especially when my daughter was small, because I could fit these tiny little hexagons in my purse and work on it. It's all by hand while she's doing her library class or whatever. This example from the museum's collection was made by a woman named Emily Ellsworth, who lived between 1834 and 1884. When you get close to it, you can see it was never finished. Emily was the daughter of Huldah Penny Ellsworth, and she was the sister of David J. Ellsworth, who was a major donor to the museum. He gave quite a lot of materials, photographs, unfortunately none of his sister, and also a great many diaries. And I was really hoping, he mentioned his sister quite a bit in his diary, and I was really hoping he would talk about her quilting, but he didn't. He talked about driving her around and things like that, but he never mentioned her quilting, much to my dismay. But Emily never married. She lived her entire life at the family homestead, which is shown right here at 773 Palisado Avenue. Lovely little pastoral shop with the cows, all the farm buildings. So it was made entirely of silk, started sometime between about 1860 and her death in 1884. So this type of pattern was the first published quilt pattern in America. The right side of the slide is from the January 1835 edition of Godey's Lady's Book. It is widely believed to be the very first published quilt pattern in America. Although we know that quilts like this were made long before that. There are paper templates surviving that have been found to date as early as 1770, and the earliest surviving quilt made in this style dates to 1807. You'll also sometimes hear hexagon quilts called Mosaic quilts, honeycomb quilts, or grandmother's flower garden. And they're made by folding pieces of fabric around a paper template. Usually, especially in the period when they didn't have the magical glue that we have now, they would put basting stitches to hold the fabric down onto the paper template, and then the pieces get whip stitched together along the edge. If you look closely at our quilt, along the piece of it that is still rolled onto the roller, you can see some of the templates she used are still there, only a few of them. They're made out of newspaper. Occasionally we're able to date the quilt by dating the newspaper that the templates are made from, but I have not been able to figure out the date of these newspaper pieces. What we can tell is that she was reusing the same templates for different parts of the same quilt. And we can tell that because you can see right here, there are pinholes that aren't being used to hold the piece to this location on the quilt. So she must have taken it out of another piece and then reused it again in this spot. Any questions about that? Yeah?
How does the newspaper hold up? It's such a thin...
Yeah, it is thin. It works out okay because the edges get a little feathery if you knit them with the whip stitches, but it's enough that you can still get that crisp edge. So it's fun to imagine Emily's quilt as a record of the gowns that people she wore, maybe her own garments or garments of friends and neighbors. It's mostly silk. That red flower spot there is made of velvet. So it's fun to see all the different patterns she included. So now I'm going to move on to log cabin quilts. We have a very, very large selection of log cabin and variations here at the museum. I have selected 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them to show you today. The log cabins were first seen in England around the 1830s, and they became more widespread in the US around the time of the Civil War. The oldest surviving signed and dated American example dates to 1869. Many American quilt scholars associate the log cabin name with Abraham Lincoln. His childhood in a log cabin was a big part of his campaign. And that might be what some quilters were thinking about when they made their quilts. However, it doesn't explain why those early English quilters were making log cabins. So another theory, and this one's pretty wild, but bear with me, is that in the early 19th century, people began excavating the Egyptian pyramids. And during that time, they were finding these small mummies. These were all mummies of cats. And all these finds were appearing in museums in Europe and around the world. And people are fascinated. This is new, exotic stuff they've never seen before. And if you look closely at the wrapping, the way the fabric strips are wrapped around these mummies, it makes a pattern that looks an awful lot like a log cabin quilt. So this might explain why people in Europe in the 1830s are making log cabin quilts. Maybe. But I don't know, I'll leave it up to you. The other possibility is that if you're using small strips of fabric around the square center, you just sort of accidentally make a log cabin shape that looks like this, and it might just be coincidental that they look alike. Who knows? So this first log cabin I'm going to talk about is one of the most straightforward in terms of its design in our collection. I date this to around 1930 because of some of the fabrics would be around 1930. Some of the ladies that were here the other day were thinking that maybe it should be dated earlier than that. So I'll let you guys take a look and see what you think. I'm always curious to hear what visitors think. And it was pieced around those red center squares using half light fabrics and half dark fabrics, and that gives it its sense of movement. Traditionally, a red center was thought to symbolize the hearth of home. You get yellow centers that are kind of a similar concept. And then there's this story that has persisted that quilts with black centers hanging on a clothesline were meant to indicate that a home was on the Underground Railroad, which is a really cool story, but it doesn't hold a lot of water. Because many of the quilts, the oldest surviving quilt is in this log cabin pattern is from 1869, which is long after the Underground Railroad ceased to operate. And many of the quilts in our collection are from the 1880s or so, or later, and they have black centers and absolutely no connection to the Underground Railroad, so unfortunately, I have to debunk that one. In the 19th century, log cabin quilts were often made of silk and wool, but in the 20th century, there was a strong reaction against the excesses of the Victorian age, so people started making their quilts out of more utilitarian materials like cotton. And you start to see a lot of really fun novelty prints in the 20th century. You're sitting in front of this quilt. Can you guess what my favorite novelty print is from here? You can see the same print in the slide too, if anybody else wants to guess.
It looks like baseball.
That is my favorite. I'm glad you saw it. This baseball print, I think, is pretty sweet. This would be a great quilt to sit on and have your little league picnic. I don't know. This quilt came from the collection of Marguerite Mills. She was a huge benefactor of this institution. Her portrait is hanging in the front lobby by the front door. And she basically paid for most of this building over there. And we have most of the contents of her home in the collection. She was a big collector. It breaks my heart because I know that she used to present her quilts at events like at First Church and probably even here at the Historical Society, and I know that she knew the story of every quilt and where she got it, when she got it, who made it, why they made it. And I wish we had transcripts of what she used to say when she presented them, but none of those stories have come down to us, so we're kind of left to guess. Anyway, it's fun to think about. This one appears to be hand-stitched. You can see the kind of wavy edges, and it's hand-quilted as well. If you look at the back of the quilt, you can see the quilting stitches are all done by hand. So this person definitely had access to a sewing machine, but preferred to do the work by hand. Moving on, we're on to this Courthouse Steps quilt. Courthouse Steps is the same basic log cabin block. In this case, the centers of each square are white, but the way the colors are arranged is designed to emphasize that diamond pattern that's supposed to look like steps leading up to a courthouse. And the white center squares recede into the background. This one is from the very early 20th century. It's mostly, I think, early 20th century shirting fabrics. And the most interesting thing about this quilt, you can see that I've got the back corner flipped up, and if you have your gloves on, you're welcome to flip back the rest of the bottom half. Can you tell what the backing fabric is? You can see it's got some printing on it, although the printing is upside down and backwards. They're very close. They appear to be mostly salt sacks. This is a sugar sack. We don't have salt sacks in the collection, we have sugar sacks. This one is Jack Frost, and I have a Revere one that's on the table next to the quilt. But they would have been printed and constructed the same way. So once they had a lot of salt bags and used them, the quilt was never finished, so this is the foundation fabric that all the strips were stitched down to. were used on that foundation fabric, the more we can date the quilt. It's just, they're very hard to read because they're upside down and backwards and faded. But this one I can read. Can you read it? Yeah, you're right. It says Worcester New. So then I went to eBay and I found the salt bag on the right for sale on eBay. I circled the part that was in this backing of our quilt, and if you look at other pieces of the back of the quilt, you can see that sort of mast that the Worcester brand salt flag is hanging from. So the Worcester Salt Manufactory was founded in Warsaw, New York in 1894, so we know this quilt dates to after 1894, and it lasted until it was bought out by Morton Salt in 1943, so we know it was made before 1943, I think quite a bit before. So I would love to figure out what some of the other salt bags are. I'm also impressed by the amount of salt this person used. These are often 10-pound bags of salt. And I don't think I've used 10 pounds of salt since I moved into my house. So they must have been doing a lot of preserving or, I don't know, salting the driveway. There's a lot of salt back there. Some of the printing was done in red, which would be a different manufacturer. I would love to know more. So our next quilt is another log cabin variation. This is a pineapple variation made by a woman named Ellsworth Phelps around the year 1870. And the story that comes with this quilt is that a friend of Ellsworth's was at a state fair in another state in Quincy, Illinois, and saw the pattern and knew that she would like it, and it cost $1.25 for the pattern, which in 1870 was quite a lot of money. But basically, a pineapple variation quilt is just like a regular log cabin square with 4 sides, except it has strips radiating out from the corners so that it has 8 sides. So we start here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, around that center square. And sometimes these are called pineapples. I guess those diamond shapes are meant to look like pineapples. Other times it's called Maltese cross. And with these black shapes, that's what I see when I look at this quilt, is a Maltese cross. What I love about this quilt is the wide variety of colors she used, but also in the black portions, she alternated a satin fabric with a velvet fabric, which makes it shimmer. A lot of movement. I think that was a pretty skillful thing to do. So here's a little bit about the quilter. These are photographs of her. Probably a little bit before her marriage and a little bit after, a few years before and a few years after. She married a man named Timothy S. Phelps in 1859, and she was the grandmother of Marguerite Mills, our benefactor, whose portrait is in the lobby. I love how her hairstyle changed from the first photo to the second. It was kind of big and poofy, which was quite popular in the 1850s, and then it got much more reserved as she grew up. So remember this woman, because she made another one of the quilts I'm going to show you. She made one of the crazy quilts, and we'll be talking about her some more. She was a very accomplished quilter, and I'm a huge fan of hers. So this next quilt is really beautiful use of color. It was given to the museum by Mrs. Sidney Royce Brahman, and she was quite the socialite. She's all over the society pages of the Hartford Courant. And I don't know if she made the quilt or if someone else made the quilt. She also made 2 of the quilts I'm going to show you today, or she gave 2 of the quilts I'm going to show you today. I don't know who made them. I think they were both by the same quilter. It was a similar color sense. And this is an overall shot of the quilt. I know it's difficult to get a sense of what the quilts look like overall because they're all folded up on the tables today. But you can see if you look at it, she was able to integrate these log cabin blocks with fan blocks in the corners. There's some other plain squares and some kind of a diamond. I don't know the name of that patch that's got the diamond with the triangle corners. But the way that she used the color and the way that she arranged the squares, you get this radiating pattern of red diamonds coming out from the center. and a lot of motion to the outside corners from these fan blocks. And she was kind of a real genius at using color. I'm pretty impressed by it. It's made pretty much all from silk and velvet. This is the donor, Maddie Brahman. She lived here in Windsor in the 1920s and 30s. She was the president of the Hartford colony of the National Society of the New England Women. She was sent to their national conference as a representative. And she was also active here at the Historical Society. Her husband was a big deal at Etna, and eventually they moved to West Hartford and continued their very stylish lifestyle. But we're very happy that she donated these quilts to us. So, if you look closely, the other really beautiful thing, in addition to her use of color, is the embroidered details you can see on that fan block. Really beautiful embroidered edges. Very, very well done. And whoever quilted the crazy quilt that I'm showing you really took the embroidery to the next level, so keep that embroidery in mind. And I just showed these to show you details of the fabrics that she used. So up next, we're on to our signature quilts. The museum has 3 signature quilts that were all made in the 1880s for First Church, which is across the street from us. It was a huge fad. Around 1885 or so, all the ladies of First Church were making these signature quilts as gifts for their ministers and the ministers' wives. So we have 3. 2 of them were made for, I'm blanking on his name. Roscoe Nelson and his wife. They were given as Christmas gifts. And then this one that I'm showing you today, because it's the one that's in the best physical condition, the silk, especially the silk quilts, tend to deteriorate quite rapidly. This one was made for the Reverend Mrs. Gowan C. Wilson, who preceded Reverend Roscoe Nelson at First Church. So Wilson worked at First Church from 1866 to 1891, and Nelson followed him from 1892 to 1932. And this was made for Christmas in 1886. So nobody's sitting back there, but if you get close, you can see a lot of famous names, really big names here in Windsor. The Hayden family has been all over for centuries here in town, and also the Ellsworth family. Check my time. Good. So if you look close, you're probably, especially if you're a genealogist and have family, you're going to recognize an ancestor's name. My favorite name on the quilt is this block, which I know is hard to read. It's quite faded, and this one I kind of tried to bump up the contrast in Photoshop. But it was signed by Mrs. Joseph H. Rainey, who was the wife of the first Black congressman in America. And they were summer residents here in Windsor. And so she signed this squared to the minister as well. And I often wonder if she did this by mail. I don't know how they accomplished this, because presumably in the wintertime in December, they would have been back in South Carolina at their home there. They only spent summers here. And the story I heard is that they came to Windsor in the summers to get away from the kind of racial tension that they experienced in South Carolina during the most of the year, which is pretty fascinating. If you want to know more about Joseph Rainey, there's a really cool article. I didn't write it, another staff person did, about Joseph Rainey and his time here in Windsor, which is pretty interesting. I wish I had a slide of Mrs. Rainey too, but I don't. So it was such a big deal and such a lot of work to create these quilts that they published articles about it in the newspaper. I know you can't read that tiny print, so I put a copy of the article on the table next to the quilt so you can get a close-up look at it. But it talks about how the quilt was hung on the Christmas tree at First Church's annual holiday gathering, which was held January 1st, 1886, at Town Hall. And most of the article is a list of all the names of people who signed it. And it also says that there would be additional people signing it, and then another row would be added to the quilt later, because they hadn't all signed it. So most of them unfinished at the time it was displayed. And it also says that the center square was contributed by the first couple Reverend Wilson ever married. Here it is. So this first couple he must have married before he even came to Windsor. It was Mr. and Mrs. Dawson, Westfield, Massachusetts, married December 26, 1866. Christmas weddings were extremely popular in the past, in the 18th and 19th century, so that's not unusual at all. And there's another very prominent square right next to this one, which is from a Mrs. Powers. And it doesn't say anything about that square in, I didn't take a picture of it, I should have. It doesn't say anything about that square in the article, but because there's a poem and everything, I'm guessing that Mrs. Powers was the one who assembled the quilt after all of the signed squares were contributed. Okay, questions about that before we move on? Let's talk about crazy quilts. We're down to our last 3 quilts. They're all crazy quilts. Crazy quilts are made of irregularly shaped scraps, usually sumptuous silks and velvets, the fanciest fabric you got, you save up and you use it on your crazy quilt. And then they get embroidered and embellished otherwise with applique, scraps of ribbon or lace. The idea is to be fancy. They were very time-consuming to produce. Most of them were stitched to a foundation fabric and then bound together. They get tied rather than quilted because they're so thick it'd be hard to quilt through them. And most of them are throw-sized to display on the back of a sofa because they're so fancy, and also because I think they were quite time-consuming to produce. They became really, really popular in America in the 1880s, although the first known example dates to 1839. Patterns were published in Godey's Lady's Book and other women's magazines like Miss Leslie's and Peterson's. In 1884, one author wrote, "No species of fancy work yet invented has ever given more scope for the exercise of artistic ability and real originality. Hence the secret of its wonderful popularity. It is probable that it will exercise its fascinations for years to come." So that's the draw. You get to show off your skill as a needlewoman and your creativity. And that's why we see so many of these made. What I love about these crazy quilts is you can often see the influences of 1880s pop culture, or the pop culture of the time that they were produced. And here's a slide. These are some of the main influences on the design of crazy quilts, particularly this one, the first one in the row. So make sure you get a close look at that. They're heavily influenced by the aesthetic movement, which is a big deal in the 1880s. It's a movement of art for art's sake. You just make something because it's pretty and not because it has some deep underlying meaning, which gets contradicted a little bit with the language of flowers part of it, because they're trying to hide a meaning in there, but mostly it's just because it's pretty. Also in the 1880s, people were really, really interested in the artwork of Kate Greenaway. That's her in the inset and one of her illustrations as the main photo in the second column there. She produced it mostly artwork for children's books, and it was an idealized version, very romantic version of what 18th century childhood looked like. This is kind of colonial revivalism at its best. And this one that I've shown here is from Marigold Garden, dates to 1875. So you can see a lot of those Kate Greenaway children in that quilt. I'll show you some examples. The other thing that people were really interested in, and this is part of the more general interest in Japanese art and culture, is Gilbert and Sullivan's Mikado comes out in the 1880s. And people are fascinated by this culture and this very unique style of art and of living. So you'll see Japanese elements in a lot of crazy quilts. Also the language of flowers. This is that Victorian notion that each flower has a meaning and that you can convey a message by combining different flowers either in a bouquet or in artwork that's created. And there are many other influences. You'll see a lot of animals, and sometimes those animals are there because they're symbolic. Other times they're there because it's just something the quilter liked. It's kind of up to you to decide what you think. Anybody see any spider webs on the crazy quilts you guys are sitting in front of? I think there's one in this last one, and there's a couple in this one. Those are very common elements of crazy quilts. It's a symbol of industry, which I think is pretty fitting for this non-stop work of creating and embellishing this crazy quilt. And also the spider web is a symbol of maybe catching inspiration or catching some other more, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of esoteric idea. So the first crazy quilt that we're going to talk about is this one, also by Ellsworth Phelps, who made the pineapple quilt. She used a lot of really colorful embroidery and fancy stitches, and if you look closely, there are 3 names stitched into the quilt. Ellen, her own name, Clara, and Annie. And I'm looking at this quilt and I'm like, who are Annie and Clara? So I started looking at the census. And I also looked into our collection. And this is a photo of the entire family standing in front of their home at 204 Palisado Avenue. So we see Kate Phelps. Kate didn't get her name in the quilt. Clara Ellsworth. She was a cousin who was orphaned and came to Connecticut to live with her aunt and uncle and cousin. And Annie Porter, who was a live-in servant. And so Clara Ellsworth, did any of you come to the fashion exhibition, or one of these, but it was Fashions of Our Friends and Neighbors I did last summer? No. I showed Clara's wedding dress at that talk, which is this really beautiful late Victorian blue satin with this plush black and yellow daisy lapels with a matching hat and everything. So if you were at that, you would have heard about Clara before. She lived in Illinois and spent her whole life there. At some point, her mother passed away. I don't know what happened to the mother. It was never really published. But we found a newspaper article that her father died of bilious fever, which sounds awful. It's like extreme gastrointestinal distress. What do I do? And after that, she came to Connecticut. And then Annie Porter, the way I read the census, she had some difficulty with her family too. Possibly she was an orphan. And she wasn't a relative, but she was clearly treated as a member of the family. She's in this photo, and also her name is in the quilt. So she was a household servant, a housekeeper, but she was also a friend. And it seems like Timothy Phelps and family were making their home open to these wayward girls who needed love and needed in their family. So that's pretty cool. And it's pretty cool that we can see that in the quilt. The other thing that this quilt has a lot of are these Kate Greenaway children that I talked about. Here are 3 examples from the quilt. It looks like the first little girl is jump roping. The blue background, I'm not sure what the boy and girl are looking at. I'm open to examples or ideas. Some of the ladies who were here the other day thought that maybe it was meant to be a no fishing sign, and that they were disappointed they couldn't go fishing. I don't know. And then the last one, this little girl is feeding her chickens. So they're very sweet. There are many, many more examples of these Kate Greenaway children at that quilt. So as you're walking around at the end of the program, please take a look at them. They're pretty adorable. And then we also get Japanese culture, like the Mikado, the other general interest. So that first image is definitely at least one vase. And then I'm not sure if that, with the square pattern, is that supposed to be a vase or is it a fan? I don't know, but it's Japanesey. And then fan blocks are everywhere. Those fans are also very Japanese. And we also get some flowers. Whether these were flowers she thought were beautiful or if we're trying to extrapolate some kind of deeper meaning from them, I don't know. So roses and rose tips equal love. Lilies are devotion or purity. Part of the difficulty is you have to try and identify what type of flower this embroidered representation of a flower is. So that kind of complicates things further. And then there's lots of farm animals on there. There's sheep, this rooster. Are these symbols of the rooster could be a symbol of awakening, or are they just farmyard friends that reminded her of things she saw in her everyday life? I don't know. And then the next quilt, which you're sitting at, has these beautiful, very plush velvet borders and the embroidered edges. This is another one that was given to us by Maddie Brahman. It's got these great embroidered outlines on everything and these beautiful fabrics. But this is the real show stealer here. In each corner, she did these very beautiful embroidered animals. So we've got an owl, a trio of owls, which would symbolize wisdom, a peacock. So maybe that's a symbol of pride or vanity. Maybe she just liked peacocks. I don't know. Butterflies in the Victorian period symbolize the soul. the type of bird changes the meaning. So if it's a swallow, which are very popular in Victorian art and jewelry, it could be a guide to safety. If it's a dove, it could be peace. I don't know what kind of bird that is. If you have thoughts, let me know. And then she did a lot of embroidered floral outlines and some of these really cool geometric patterns. To me, that looks like a daisy, which would be a symbol of innocence or purity. And then you can tell she was a collector of really beautiful fabrics, like my mother. My mother had bags and bags of just small scraps of really beautiful fabrics that she never knew what to do with. So I think that they would have been kindred spirits. But this first slide with the floral, that's a purchased scrap of ribbon, and if you look closely at it, you can see that there's kind of a lace woven into the pink petals of that flower. And then you get this, it's almost like arrows in the center, and then all these other really beautiful fabrics. I like that kind of sort of paisley looking one a lot. So next one is the last quilt, and then I will turn you loose to look at all the quilts. I'm still doing it on time, I'm proud of myself. So the members of the Scoville and Penny families worked together to create this quilt, I think, over a great many generations, and this quilt came to us in 1995. The Scovilles and Pennies in particular are another big name family here in Windsor. Penny is a founders of ancient Windsor family name. And this one, whereas the two other crazy quilts were created, they're crazy, but each crazy portion was as a square with straight edges that were stitched together. That one has no straight edges at all. It's just like crazy all over everywhere. And it's got tremendous, tremendous embellishment. This one has a lot of silk ribbon embroidery. People started using silk ribbon embroidery as far back as the 17th century, or possibly even before that. And saw a resurgence in the Victorian period, and then again in the 1990s. I know Sue and I both used to really love Victorian magazine back in the 90s, and Sue said because of that she bought a silk ribbon embroidery kit, and I know a lot of women who did that, so kind of a deal. I don't know when many of these ribbon embroideries date from on this quilt, but I do love how they used the purple edge of the ribbon in that first image to make a two-tone shading on that type of flower. And then these are folded in such a way that they look to me like sweet peas, with the embroidered stems and leaves and centers. And they also did quite a lot of applique on this quilt. It's the only one with a lot of applique. So I love how they use the shading of the velvet and the other fabric. I also kind of wonder if they maybe bleached the edges a little bit to give it that shading to look like the petals are shaded. And then they've got some animals, a lot of little cats. You wonder if this was meant to look like one of their family pets. I don't know. And then insects like butterflies all over it. So some of the fabrics are very clearly fabrics that were early, from the 19th century. And then others of them look a lot neater to me. This one to me looks like a 40s or 50s Hawaiian shirt, and it's got that kind of 20th century style of offset printing. So this quilt came into the collection with a date of 1850 to 1880, which feels pretty early to me. I think it's actually, some of the fabrics are maybe from 1850, 1860, 1880, but that it was finished in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. So like a multi-generational project. And there's another fabric, I hope you get a chance to look up close at that. It's a bowl of crocuses, and I swear that bowl of crocuses is a scrap of a Vera Newman scarf. So I want you to look closely at it, tell me what you think. So that would be more of the 1960s fabric. So I think, to me, that proves that this was a really multi-generational project. Many Scovilles and Pennies working together to make this beautiful art object that we have today. And that's the end. So I'm happy to answer questions. And if you're ready to move, I ask that you maintain your social distancing, and I think the best thing that we can do is move in a clockwise direction. So single file in this direction in the front row, and in that direction in the back row, and that way you guys can still see all the quilts, but also stay safe and healthy, which is my main goal today, is trying to keep everyone safe and healthy. So anyway, thank you so much for coming out today and helping us test out this brave new world of in-person programs. And I look forward to speaking to you and answering any questions you have. Have fun. Enjoy looking at the quilts.